75 years old, gone, wiped out by ransomware. And I've seen across the accountancy space, accountants going, I'm not really going to buy cyber cover, and it's mad. If you're selling a professional service, people buy from you, trust.
We vastly underestimate the potential risk and impact of cybersecurity. Small businesses, the likelihood is that you won't even realize that someone's got into your systems and taken your data until it's too late. The weakest link in any organization is your people. Training is absolutely fundamental. If you're not even giving people the very basic tools at their disposal to understand how to spot a phishing attack, you're lost. The broader technology landscape is so fractured that fundamentally small business owners in particular don't really know where to turn to. The one big thing that I found as a consequence of cloud was that it changed the game in terms of the competitive landscape, because it lowered the bar of entry into the marketplace to be able to offer a whole bunch of services. I've got a whole bunch of friends in the industry who were working for big four firms. They just got a little bit fed up of the same old stuff, and they basically said, look, I can do this better myself, or I can do this better with a couple of people around me, and set up their own firms. Some of them have been incredibly successful.
Hi, I'm Mark Costello, Chief Exec of Meshed. I'm joined today by John Toon. Hi, John.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm very well, John. I'm very well. Do you want to start, obviously, by telling us a bit about you? You've recently changed role, all of that stuff, and...
Yeah, it's been a tumultuous few weeks, I guess. So I've literally, as you say, just changed role 2 weeks ago. Now working for HLB International, which is an international network of accounting firms across the globe, 350 firms across 155 countries, and around about 50,000 employees across all those firms. So massive change for me, at least. So I'm joined as like the global CTO and like head of technology, and that role, I guess, is designed to deliver our strategic objectives that the network has, and one of those pillars of that strategy is around technology and maturity in technology, but also then to sort of engage with our practices and help them to move along the sort of the technological evolution that's happening, and of course AI is a big part of that. But previous to that, I worked for Beaver and Shudders, so a firm based here in Manchester, where we are today, and we were about 300 people, and I led a digital transformation team for about the last 3 years, who did both work projects internally within the practice about modernization, efficiency, streamlining, etc., but then also engaged and contracted and consulted with clients on similar projects, and we did a mixture of stuff. So we did some really basic stuff around accounting technology, but we also did some software development and some data work as well, in terms of analyzing, presenting, cleaning data, etc. And then prior to that, I was working effectively in the audit department for that practice as well.
So you transited from being an accountant to being a technologist, really?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always had an interest in technology, and that goes back. I've been in this career for over 20 years now, and that goes back to very early days, I guess. And I worked and trained at a very small practice with 4 partners, and that didn't have a big IT function, as it were. It was really one partner and one person that kind of helped out. And over time, it became a bit more complex, and they needed someone else to kind of help fill in the blanks, and someone to take the backups home on a Friday night and all that kind of jazz. So I guess that's kind of part of how that came about. And then with the sort of the revolution of like cloud accounting in probably about 2008, 2009, that really like sparked a really interesting for me, and obviously incredibly relevant, because you had products like Cashflow and then Xero coming into market. Trying to unseat Sage 50 and Iris and a few others, and I could see like the huge opportunity that provided for our clients and for us as a business to kind of do something different. So that was something that I started to work on, but it was always done as a sort of a part-time job on the side of the core day-to-day accounting roles that I had.
Very cool. And so I'm kind of the similar vintage to yourself, and I've worked in the insurance market for a similar period as you have. And technology really hasn't disrupted insurance in the same way that it seems to have in the accountancy market. So like you go to Accountex or the Digital Accountancy Show, and almost every stand is some tech vendor selling technology.
Yeah.
Where if you go to Biba, it's the same people selling the same tech they have been for 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible. It's an incredibly dynamic market, and it's fascinating to me. We're here in the UK, and I guess in the context of my global role, the UK is probably one of the most dynamic accounting software markets in the world. The US is obviously one of them because it's huge and massive scale. Australia to a degree, although it seems to have definitely quietened down in the last few years, and I guess that's probably a legacy of a level of innovation that's stopped happening as a consequence of Xero's maturity, maybe in the market. But you can compare us to, say, China. You compare us to say the other sort of Far East, Middle Eastern countries, and a lot of Europe. And actually, the UK is just really bubbling under. It's incredible.
And when you think about that text digital platform coming in, what one of the things that I've noticed a lot in the accountancy space, eh, not thinking about technology, is that accountants seem to be very open to collaborating with each other and sharing ideas, sharing best practice.
Yeah,
That is not something you see in the insurance market at all. It's
yeah.
all very guarded. Was the cloud accountancy thing the kind of catalyst for making that happen?
Do you know what? I think it was to a degree, and probably, you've got to say that I think Zero in particular had a real impact on that, insofar as they had an approach to market which was to engage accountants and bookkeepers, but to engage them in a way that said, look, this is not a competitive thing. There's plenty of business out there. You guys should be sharing best practices, and we're going to encourage you to do that by bringing you together and to do that. And I would say, certainly if I go back to the early parts of my career, and I worked here in the Northwest in Preston. There were a whole bunch of accountants in the area, some big, some small, and I certainly at that point in time looked out in the market and went, they're all my competitors, and I want to beat them or destroy them or outcompete them or
Yeah.
whatever it is. And yet now, and maybe it's just because I'm a bit older as well, but I kind of, having worked here in the Manchester market, I don't have that same kind of view. In fact, I have friends that work in firms in and around the area, big and small, who I fairly regularly speak to, and we share notes and ideas and stuff. And I just think there's a level of maturity come into the market, which has probably been driven a little bit by the technology space, but also I think it's just that I think people just realize you've got to be a bit more open about what's going on. And quite often the challenges that we face as a practice, when I was at Beavers, are very similar to ones that other people are feeling as well. There might be scale differences, but quite often there's a problem around talent. There's a problem around technology. There's a problem around time and having enough time to be able to do research and dedicate it to doing projects and stuff. And it doesn't matter whether you're a business with 20 people or a business with 1,000 people. Those problems almost always are reflective. And I think what happens probably, and this probably happens as you start to get very big, is I think a corporate mindset tends to kick in, and you tend to look at other people as direct competitors, and so you're a little less willing to communicate. It's really interesting with my role with the network, because the network kind of breaks those boundaries down again. So the whole purpose of the network that we have is that people are there to collaborate and to share ideas and to communicate about the challenges that they have, and we can collectively try and respond to that and overcome some of those challenges. And that does work. There are still other problems to deal with in terms of communication and breaking down some of those silos, but I think it makes the sector better as a consequence of that kind of level of collaboration and willingness to share ideas.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I can't tell you why it doesn't exist in our market, but it doesn't. One of the other things that I've heard from a few accountants, I would say certainly more from the older vintage, but that's that I think that there's a danger we lose the older vintage's intellectual property. I
Mm.
mean, in the insurance market, something like it's a huge swathe of people are due to retire in the next 5 years, right? And
Yeah.
that IP will just go, and that is something that as an industry we need to think about how we make sure that that IP gets sucked out before it goes.
Yeah.
Um, but certainly a few older accountants have said to me, when Zero came in, it kind of disrupted bookkeeping more than it disrupted accounting, and a few that again older vintage people that I've spoke to think that accountants lose a wee bit of control about what their clients doing because they're not doing the bookkeeping to the same level as they once were before. Is that something that you kind of feel or understand?
Um, yeah, I can understand that sentiment. I mean, I guess, um, you know, the thing about products like Zero, and obviously you had cash flow that was just before it, and QuickBooks as well, then came in with QuickBooks Online, is it definitely changed the dynamic for me. Actually, what I found, and it did have an impact on bookkeeping, and I think it raised the awareness of bookkeeping. You know, accounting practices in general had typically offered bookkeeping, but I think bookkeeping as a sort of a specialist sort of subsect of that had often been sort of overlooked, and quite often, you know, I don't think accountancy firms would maybe collaborate with bookkeeping firms as much as maybe they do now, and there probably wasn't the same level of respect that there was, and I know that some bookkeepers would argue that that still doesn't exist in
Yeah.
some respects. But I think the one big thing that I found as a consequence of cloud was that it changed the game in terms of the competitive landscape, because it lowered the bar of entry into the marketplace to be able to offer a whole bunch of services. So, you know, I've got a whole bunch of friends and people that I know in the industry who were working for other firms, whether it was a really big top, you know, big four firms or other firms, where they just got a little bit fed up of kind of the same old stuff. And they basically said, look, I can do this better myself, or I can do this better with a couple of people around me, and set up their own firms. Some of them have been incredibly successful. Some of them have been less successful, but I guess that's all in, you know, in the eye of the beholder. And some of them just wanted their own independence in some respects. But what it did is, like I say, it lowered the bars in terms of like the barrier to entry to becoming a practice, because all of a sudden you weren't having to invest so much in very, very expensive on-prem technology with servers and everything else that goes with
Yeah.
it to start up a practice. You could do pretty much everything in the cloud. You could service clients on Xero or QuickBooks with, you know, decent practice management solutions and a whole bunch of other stuff that came out of the ecosystem as a consequence of this change. And that meant that, you know, you could actually scale a business quite quickly as well. So I was a you know, consultant for a while, doing kind of like virtual CF services, you know, and the challenge for me at the time was I was just doing it on the cusp of this transition between on-prem and cloud, and getting and attracting clients was quite challenging, particularly if they were desktop-based clients, because it was really difficult for me to kind of like deal with them day to day because of the inefficiencies of the process and the time that it took me to get information. And what I spent a lot of time doing was moving them to the cloud, because it made my life a whole lot
Yeah.
easier.
Easier. Yeah.
And I could scale out and offer more to them as a consequence. And I think that's just what happened in the accounting segment. I think one of the challenges that like mid-sized firms where I was at with Beaver and Struthers was that we were sort of caught a little bit in the middle here, because for a period of time, you know, we were being outspent by our big competitors in terms of just broader technology investment, and we were being outcompeted from a sort of an agility and a new way of engaging with clients in terms of offering proper customer service and client experience, which the smaller firms were really focusing in on as a consequence of like stuff that Xero and QuickBooks and others were talking about, and you know, people sharing ideas and this idea. One of the other things that I saw as well as a consequence of the cloud transition was that people started to draw in experiences from other products, because they weren't just buying an account system anymore. They were going out and saying, oh, maybe we need a CRM. And actually most firms had never looked at a CRM before. Or maybe we need a project management software, or maybe we need a task management software. And they were going out and buying products that, say, you know, agencies were using, or that marketing businesses were using, or something else. And that suddenly changed their thinking, because all of a sudden they were exposed to a different way of running a business and operating with customers. And so that changed the game for a lot of small practices, and like I say, put a competitive squeeze on mid-sized practices, because mid-sized practices got caught in the middle. We had a whole bunch of old technology, and we had a really great client base, but we really struggled to move that client base and the fundamental, like, you know, practice technology towards the cloud, and it's still not possible for a lot of firms to do it fully. So you ended up then in this hybrid situation of some on-prem stuff, some cloud stuff, and then how do you kind of plumb that together in a way that works?
Yeah. I think that's interesting. Tax Digital must have helped to bring that along, because like the bigger firms are already pretty much there, right?
Yeah.
Although it still beggars belief how little publicity there's been about making Tax Digital, right? The government
Yeah.
seem to have made a complete and utter shambles of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mean, I am challenged around making tax digital in terms of like, you know, fundamentally, what are the real objectives that the government or HMRC are trying to achieve, but also what's the real impact. You know, if you go back to like making tax digital for VAT, and I can't remember the stats now, but they were banded around a few years ago, it was that, you know, I think it was something like 20% or possibly more of like VAT returns that were filed through the old government gateway that
Yeah,
existed, and effectively came from a manual system of some description.
yeah,
There was then another tranche of businesses where they were using software of some description, whether it was Sage 50 or NetSuite or whatever it was, but they weren't submitting it through the software, so they were still going to the government portal to do it. But at least it was kind of digital, and the only gap was that kind of like the step between taking it out of the system and pressing the button with HMRC. And then the rest were already filing through their software and doing VAT returns through their software. And the only thing that really changed for them was that the software got updated to move from the old platform to the Making Tax Digital platform. Now that transition to Making Tax Digital, as I went through it with the practice, fundamentally wasn't that difficult, really. Yes, we had to do a bit of communication with clients. We had to do some convincing of clients, but with the combination of a lot of them already being on an accounting platform, most of which were compliant eventually. Some of them took longer than others. That transition wasn't really much difficult because all they did was go from pressing a button which sent it to one place to pressing a button that sent it to somewhere else.
Yeah.
And then we had bridging software that kind of closed the gap on the ones that were reticent to change or wanted to stay using Excel or something, for example, which was perfectly valid for a small scale business. I think where I would have felt the next natural step would have been to go down the route of bringing corporation tax into MTD, not income tax like we've got next April. And the reason for my thinking of that is that, number one, and I know there's an issue with not-for-profits and charities, so we definitely need to put those to one side to kind of to begin with. But most corporate businesses, most companies, preparing a corporation tax return, will be VAT registered. And again, I don't have the stats to hand, but I know if you kind of do the research, there's a significant number of companies that have to file a corporation tax return that are already filing a VAT return. So to move them into a quarterly reporting regime, they're already there because they're doing it for VAT. And so you could almost say that you could combine VAT and corporate tax in one button click almost. You've also got bigger organizations that are in the quarterly payments regime, so they're used to actually paying corporation tax quarterly. As well. So there's an added incentive for them to actually be providing quarterly numbers which are more accurate than the estimates that they have to go through to do their quarterly payments. And so there are business incentives to doing this. Now, I know there is a challenge with not-for-profits and charities because they do have to provide corporation tax returns.
But not VAT, yeah.
But and not necessarily VAT because very few of them will be VAT registered. But there's no reason why you couldn't just say, hey, we know this is a big problem, so what we're just going to do is just going to set you aside for 3 or 4 years or 5 years or whatever the timescale is, and then we'll figure out how we kind of deal with this. Because the irony is the not-for-profit sector is an area that needs a huge amount of digitization. There's reasons for that, volunteer-led organizations, a lack of funds to be able to invest in some of these platforms.
No corporate strategy, right?
No strategy, no awareness of what's out there as well. But my experience, because I've been a treasurer for a members club and done various other bits in the sector, my experience is if you digitize those organizations, they suddenly become like hyper efficient, and they're not wasting as much volunteer time, and they're not wasting money on other things where it's frankly wasted. But they just don't realize it, and they don't know any better, unfortunately. But that should be like one of the primary objectives of something like Making Tax Digital. It should be about encouraging organizations to be more efficient. I know we're talking, the revenue want to close the tax gap and they want to reduce the incidence of mistakes and other things. But we also know that if you digitize, you can increase the level of mistakes because people don't necessarily know how to use these systems, or they can have an automation running in a system that exacerbates the mistakes by doing the same thing over and over and over repetitively. So we're in this world where we're moving to income tax, and that's going to be challenging. And it's challenging for a number of reasons. It's challenging because a lot of people preparing income tax returns that are going to be caught, particularly landlords, are running, sometimes running their business on a little black book, frankly.
Yeah.
And that works for them. So there are a whole plethora of issues, and the communication is a big one. And I don't feel that the revenue cover themselves in glory because they seem to kind of pass that responsibility onto accountants and bookkeepers and tax people to kind of do this level of communication, which I think is frankly unfair.
Yeah, I agree, right? Because I think that where this is really going to hurt people is all of those like independent people who might be like a hairdresser or a photographer, but like they're only making 20,000-30,000 pounds a year. And seeing HMRC says this is going to cost these people 15 quid a year. You're like, what are you basing that on?
Yeah, there's no chance. There's no chance. I mean, the harsh reality of like MTD for income tax is that you're moving from doing one return to 4 quarterly submissions plus a final return. That if you pay if you're going to engage a professional, it's going to come with a cost.
It's £100 every time.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
£15.
Absolutely. Plus, then you've got the additional costs of software and other things. And yes, you could make an argument. So if you talk about the hairdresser, for example, right? The hairdresser turning over 20, 30 grand, they may be operating on a cash only basis. And I'm not going to criticize that. It's entirely legitimate. Obviously there were people who say, well, that's a potential risk for fraud, and it absolutely is. But that's a very valid way of operating. I would say with my technology hat on though, if I was a hairdresser and I was, either had a salon or I was doing it remotely and visiting people, wouldn't it be better for me to offer a customer experience where I can pay by card, for example, or I can pay more easily? That requires a certain level of technology because it needs you to have, a Stripe account, or it needs you to have a Square account or something like that to be able to take those payments, or even a Zero account or something like that, because you can now do it through those platforms. But if you're going to do that, that requires a certain level of investment, but then it also requires a certain level of integration to make some of that processing a little bit easier. Because one of the things I also have seen a lot of with SMEs is they've been sold a POS system by a salesman from a bank or from a supplier, and they get it and they invest, not insignificant amount of money and then recurring, subscriptions and things. And then when you look at it, it doesn't connect to their account system, or it doesn't connect to some of their other systems. So if they're operating a restaurant or a bar or something, it won't connect to a whole bunch of other things that are really important for them. And so you end up with this fractured landscape of products, none of which integrate. And so all you end up doing is creating more admin and burden for that person, because then they've got to start doing reports in Excel to get the right information that they want to put it into their finance system, for example, or they've got to get data around their shifts to get it out of one system and put it into somewhere else so they can make sure that they've got the right number of staff on. And you could see that in lots and lots of examples of small businesses. And the problem about that is that the broader technology landscape is so fractured, and there's so many people offering these services that fundamentally small business owners in particular don't really know where to turn to, and their accountants aren't necessarily offering this as a service, and so they are at the whim of whoever gets through the door and then sells something to them, whether that's right or wrong.
Yeah, it's funny because I had a conversation with a small business owner, and it is a bit like how TV's got, right? You get Apple, Netflix, Amazon, and you go, I can't remember what everything's on, and whether I'm subscribed to that one or not, it just becomes a problem. It's funny that you brought up that connectivity piece as well, because I think that's the next, well, there's two next great, horizon views on technology, and it is the integration of everything, and then it's how does AI fit into that. From where I sit, we're insurance experts, so I've spent my life dealing with businesses who never think they're going to have a claim, and then they do, right? And one of the things that I think is terrifying, I mean, I think it should be mandatory. It's the law that you must have employer's liability cover in the UK since, was it 1970 something? I can't remember what year it was. I think cyber insurance should be mandatory, and I think that at least some sort of basic framework of cybersecurity to support that insurance product should be mandatory as well. 20% of businesses in the UK buy cyber insurance cover. 20%.
Really? Wow, that's incredible.
Which would suggest to me that 20% rely on the firewalls that they get from Microsoft or Google as well, right? And that's it. And that is their idea of security. And I've seen across the accountancy space, accountants going, I'm not really going to buy cyber cover. And it's mad. It really is. I mean, you look at what happened to Jaguar Land Rover, Marks and Spencer's. There was also Bishop's Move or whatever they're called. No, it was not Old Knights, the haulage company. 75 years old, gone, wiped out. By ransomware. If you're in professional services and you're selling a professional service, one of the unspoken tacit things that people buy from you is trust. And if you're not protecting your data from that end point, that's not great, is it?
I was actually at an event yesterday which the ICAW ran, and I was speaking at it, and it was in Chester, and the whole sort of premise of it was to talk about sort of technology updates. So the cyber was covered, as well as a whole bunch of other things. And one of the speakers was talking about the cyber was actually from the Northwest Cyber Resilience Centre here, and he was talking about the fact that there are something like 9 million cyber attacks almost a year.
Yeah.
Lots of them go unreported. Lots of them are hidden away because people don't want to be embarrassed about it or
Yeah.
confess or have to deal with the implications of that. And something like I think the stat was 17% of businesses do basic cyber training for their organizations. That absolutely staggers me. I ran our IT function at Beamer Shuthers, and cybersecurity was like the top priority for us in terms of like our IT function. And ironically, it was the one area where I could get the partners pretty much to write a blank check. Because if I said we're going to put our data at risk if we don't do this, it was like, right, okay, how do we fix it?
Yeah.
And it was almost, that was the mentality that we had. And okay, we're a larger organization and we can maybe invest, but actually the investments that we were making, and if you look at the scale, are not that expensive.
No, they're not.
And you talk about mandatory cyber insurance. What's really fascinating that's happening in the US market, for example, is that US insurers are now refusing to give cyber insurance to businesses that don't have a really comprehensive cybersecurity stance,
Yeah.
including investing in things like a SOC, a security operations center, which is something that you wouldn't see a huge amount of here in the UK. But this is a fundamental. Is like if you don't have that insurance in the US, you can't actually go out in business because people won't engage with you because of the nature of the way that people work their commercial agreements over there. Is they want to see what kind of cover you've got.
Yes.
And it puts you at a huge risk. So I completely agree with you in terms of I think we vastly underestimate the potential risk and impact of cybersecurity. We make this assumption. Not just as accountants, but as small businesses, we make this assumption that it's a big business problem.
Yes.
Because we see the headlines around M&S and other people, for example. The fundamental reality is like, small businesses which have got a weak cybersecurity stance are easy pickings for anyone that wants to do something. And fundamentally, if you don't have a strong cybersecurity stance, the likelihood is that you won't even realize that someone's got into your systems and taken your data.
No, you won't.
Until it's too late. And quite often these people will sit lurking in systems for months and months at an end
before they do anything.
Before something happens. And the weakest link in any organization isn't your firewalls, isn't your other software that you might have paid for. It's your people. And so that training point is absolutely fundamental. If you're not even giving people the very basic like tools at their disposal to understand how to spot a phishing attack, how to understand when someone might be perpetrating fraud effectively in your organization, then you're lost. You can spend as much money in the world as you like on technology. You won't fix that problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a bit like what we were saying about making tax digital. The government haven't done a good job of telling the world what's going on here. I think our industry's done a bad job of telling the world what the problem is. So when I look back to when I started as a broker, about 10% of businesses in the UK bought directors and officers cover.
Yeah.
Again, I still struggle to sell that, and I can't believe that people, because it costs almost nothing. And if you're running a business, what people don't get is they go, well, that never happened to me. But what they don't get is solicitors, if they're looking to come after that business, they might go, well, if that's the weaker point, is to go after the directors. So they do it that way as opposed to going after the commercial entity. But I think that the cyber thing, we've just not sold it well. And if you look at like the accountancy profession, it's the hacker's dream, right? You've got UTRs, passport photographs on systems, personal national insurance numbers, home addresses, bank details. I mean, it's
income details.
It's Shangri-La, right, to go after. That's a gap, and that's something that we're hoping to try and help deal with.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to a friend of mine who works in the industry. He's not an accountant, but he works in the sort of the periphery of the industry, and mixture of marketing and technology sort of experience. And between him, and it was a while ago since we last caught up, so it was beginning of the year, but we could name 12 practices that we were aware of that had a cyber incident of some description, and had either lost data or had had to like come to some resolution around that.
Yeah.
that's 12 practices, and none of that was in any of the accounting press. None of it was known publicly.
Yeah.
But that was the stuff that we just knew through our own sort of personal and professional connections. We had a cyber incident at Beamer and Shutters. I don't think it's unfair to talk about that. That was about 3.5 years ago. It wasn't serious. We ended up, someone had just clicked on a link, and we ended up just sending out tons and tons of emails out of our system. So we didn't lose any data. There was no client data at risk. But it was just as simple as someone had received an email and clicked on it. And luckily we had the right systems in place to pick that up really, really quickly, because we suddenly saw a whole bunch of unusual traffic happening. But if that had been allowed to continue without us knowing about it, and go on further and further, we could potentially have been at risk if we didn't have the right systems in place, and we didn't have the right procedures to manage that. And so that is the fundamental risk. And again, it goes back to, this was someone in the organization who'd had all of the training, who'd been, we did regular monitoring, still do regular monitoring, and yet things still get through. One of the things that I've seen recently, which someone pushed out on LinkedIn really recently, was an email coming out that looks like it's from Microsoft. And quite often you can spot phishing attacks because of the way that the emails and stuff are dealt with. But they'd been really clever, because they'd spelt Microsoft. The M in Microsoft had been spelt with an R and an N.
Oh,
so
right.
When you put it really close together,
I seen that as well.
It looks like an M.
Some of them now, it's just different fonts.
Yeah,
that's the only difference. And that's why I think you need that extra layer of AI protection in behind that.
Well, talking about AI, we need it anyway, because we know that quite a lot of this, particularly the very high profile stuff, is being perpetrated by likes of cyber gangs in Russia, in North Korea, and places that are not friendly to the West, essentially. And they are using AI technology. And again, you go back to a classic phishing campaign. You go back 10 years ago, and it was, hey, I'm a Nigerian prince, please send me $5,000 or whatever. And it was really, really obvious that it was fraud. And frankly, if you'd had even just a modicum of training, you would have noticed that a mile off. Well, the level of sophistication that you can get with AI now, in terms of not just making sure that there are no spelling mistakes and it's not so obvious that it's not so blatant, but the psychological kind of elements that they add into some of these campaigns, in terms of being able to manipulate you and think, oh, this is urgent, so you must action this really, really quickly. And then people panic, and they don't step back, because they go, oh, this, you've suddenly asked me for something that needs to happen right now. Okay, I'm going to respond and deal with it, without actually taking a pause and actually saying, is this genuine?
So in my last business, we had an email coming into one of the team saying, it's Mark, I'm in London, I've lost my phone, can you transfer money to this bank account so I can get money out? Now, anybody that has worked for me knows that I am notorious for losing phones. So it seems totally legit.
Yeah.
And it was written like it was me that was writing it.
Yeah.
And Mags at the time went, I don't think that's right. And she phoned me. But, I was chief executive, was sent to a junior member of staff, Oh, and it was like £500. It wasn't 25 grand. And that could easily just happen. Then once you do one transaction, then that's they're in, right? Because they're watching everything. So we had to have a complete sweep of the system, clean it out, make sure that everything was gone. But I think that it is really important that people do that, because I think that, like everything else in life, there is bad to AI and there is amazing to AI. And it's something that's core to our business. How do you see it changing accountancy over the next 3, 5, 10 years?
Oh, well, that's a very loaded question. I would say I don't think that there is bad AI or bad
no, the bad actors using
bad actors.
it.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is like, technology is what it is, and I guess what's interesting with AI, and I guess we're talking more probably about large language models, because that's what everyone kind of badges stuff at. Is that we know that there are inherent biases in these, because of the way that they learn, and they're learning from us. We're inherently biased, and so that's just something to be aware of when you're using these technologies. I think in terms of where do I see we're going to be going in 3, 5, 10 years, I would say it's almost impossible now to predict this out. I was talking to someone that I know, a guy called Dave Coplin, who used to work for Microsoft a while back, and he now sort of consults with businesses about sort of future vision and where things are going. And he was saying to me, a few years ago, it was really easy because you could sort of say, right, I know exactly where this industry is going, and I can probably plot this out for the next, not just 10 years, maybe the
Till
next 50
retirement.
years.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And now that's almost impossible because of the pace of change, the dynamism that we're seeing in the marketplace, not just driven by technology, but driven by people reacting to what's happening, and also politically, we're in a very sort of unstable point of time in terms of what's happening around the world and things. But fundamentally, to go back to the question, I would be massively unwilling to predict where we go in 10 years. I'd probably be massively unwilling to predict where we go in 5 years because I think it's so difficult to figure out what's going to happen. Um, I think in the next sort of 2 to 3 years, we are going to see an impact from AI. Now, I don't want to kind of overplay it, but I don't want to underplay it either because because the realms of what the art of the possible is at the moment is that we fundamentally could be hugely disrupted by AI and broader technology changes when it comes to delivering compliance. And we were talking about, before we recorded, about the fact that probably about 80% of accounting work, however you want to badge it, is probably compliance work, and the level of advisory that happens is kind of a bolt onto that, and a small part of the market. Now, with changes like MTD, with changes with our clients wanting to engage with LLMs like they were doing with Google before they came to us to check advice and check things before they get to us, I could perceive that there would be a business, whether it's an accounting practice or whether it's a technology business, that could come in and fundamentally change the way that compliance is delivered to the market, using all of the technology that's available to them at the moment. And if they were to do that, that turns a lot of the compliance into a commodity. And if it turns compliance into a commodity, what will happen is the price will be driven down. And we've already seen this. We see this in payroll. We see it in bookkeeping as well to a degree.
Exactly. Yeah.
There is a cap on the price that bookkeepers can charge per hour or per transaction or whatever it is. And it's the same in payroll. There's a cap on the price that you can charge per payslip, per head, per service that you deliver. And if that happens in tax, if it happens in accounting, those are the sort of the next two that you could see that happening to. That's going to fundamentally change the business models for accounting practices because you're going to have to be super efficient in the way that you deliver that service. If you imagine, I don't know, if you deliver a personal tax return, for example, at the moment for £250, what happens if someone comes into the market and offers it for 50? And they do that at scale in a way that's competitive with you, and you start losing customers to it. And I don't think that's impossible to envision. We already know that as a consequence of MTD for ITSA, quite a lot of the banks are getting involved in personal tax return compliance. Even if it's just the quarterly stuff, the quarterly submissions, we're seeing a huge number of obviously technology vendors coming into the market, and obviously at the moment the vast majority of them saying we want to complement the accounting and bookkeeping practice, not compete. But we know that QuickBooks or Intuit in the US already offer a tax service, and it's a hugely low cost service, and it is competing with other practices. And so there are elements of that. And the UK in particular as a region is massively unprotected as a consequence of the deregulation of the accounting and bookkeeping market. The only real regulated sectors that we operate in are audit and corporate recovery, to be honest. I mean, there are some other very nuanced bits and pieces, but bookkeeping, accounting, brought everything tax related, a lot of the other advisory services are entirely unregulated, and anyone can come into the market and deliver them. That's vastly different from the US, vastly different from the majority of Europe and Australia and places like that. In fact, vastly different from almost the entire world. And so we could almost be the petri dish for testing of what the art of the possible is from a technology point of view and how disruptive that could be.
Yeah. So I agree with a lot of what you say. I think that there's people saying that AI is going to disrupt what, like in 18 months is going to wipe out 30% of jobs. I just fundamentally think that's for the birds, right? But I also think that large language models have got a limit on them as well. So I've got a basic view on technology. So I think that small language models are the future actually, as opposed
Yeah.
to large language models,
Yeah.
bespoke to your own organization. Um, but I also, so when I said that I see lots of tech vendors at accountancy shows and whatever, I think a lot of them claim to do stuff that just doesn't even make sense to me. So when they're saying that they can, they've got out the box practice software that just runs your whole workflow, But
Yeah.
that to me is IT consultancy. That's not a product.
Well, I mean, I would say the challenge for anyone that sort of says I want to automate a process is that we talked before about how competitive like the accounting technology space is and how many vendors there are. It's actually staggering to me how we sustain this in the UK because we have more vendors probably here in the UK than the American market does, for example.
Right,
And
okay.
yet, the American market's
It's
what
10
20
times,
times
yeah.
size. Yeah, it's bonkers. And that comes down to it comes down to a whole bunch of different things. The dominance of the big players like Intuit and others, and also a level of competitive market and also regulation. To be fair, but yeah, so it's fascinating. But I guess the challenge then from a technology point of view, and I've seen this for the last 10 years, if not longer, is that people come in and say, "Oh, hey, we can help you automate tax." And then you say, well, okay, well, we use Digita. Can you automate Digita? No, we don't do Digita. What about CCH? Oh, no, we don't deal with CCH. What about Iris? Oh, yeah, we deal with Iris. Right, okay. Well, I'm not moving to Iris just so you can automate my process
Yeah.
because the product doesn't work for us or it's not suitable or whatever. And that's the problem that a lot of technology businesses coming into the market don't necessarily understand and realize is the complexity of the makeup of the firms and then the makeup of the technology underlying what they're doing and stuff. I think the cloud change makes that easier because as we move away from on-prem systems, it is much easier to overlay over the top. That does require good quality APIs or increasingly in the AI space MCP servers.
Yeah.
But that's we're still a way off that. And going back to whether or not AI is going to sort of kill the accounting market, we've seen with the cloud revolution that technology adoption is still very slow in our space. And actually it's difficult. It's difficult to kind of predict because will a whole bunch of accounting firms jump on the AI agenda and large language models or small language models, or not? And again, it's almost impossible to say that. We know that big firms are making big investments. We know that a lot of other firms are interested in this, but really a lot of firms are also vendor led in their approach to technology. And so it's difficult to say how disruptive things could be. And also, it's also difficult to say how quickly would other firms adapt to significant disruption, like I was talking about in terms of the commoditization of services and what their reaction to that would become like. That's why there's lots of unknowns. I think the other point maybe to make on sort of broader technology I think sometimes from a professional point of view, we oversell our level of expertise, and we see it a lot, and we've seen it a lot in accounting over my career at least, is that I've seen accountants overextend themselves into an area where they don't have the expertise to deliver a good service and end up sometimes getting egg on their face and regulatory impact. And also we're a bunch of professionals who don't like to say we don't know or we can't do that. And that's very dangerous. And the problem with operating in a large language model world, or even a small language model world that's specialist to the accounting sector, is we can never know as much as a large language model or a small language model will ever know about an area of expertise. And I think it's disingenuous for us to pretend that isn't going to disrupt the way that we deliver service.
Yeah, so my view on this, and again, I don't know how we think about this scaling out, but I think so. Like I'm an insurance broker, right? We've got 52 different insurers that we deal with. There's probably 10 to 20 contracts across each one of those insurers. What large language models is amazing at is for an experienced person puts it in and goes, find the clause about this, because they're all slightly different for each insurer.
Yeah.
So what's that done? That's just made me much quicker at what I do, right?
Yeah.
But if you build that small language model properly, then it doesn't become it's a data lake, right? Small language models are just a different name for a data lake.
Yeah.
But if you're controlling that environment and you then go and you grab, I talked earlier about 60% of the workforce getting to retirement age in 5 years, you'll grab some of those people and get them to train it so that the lake's getting different views.
Yeah.
And then that becomes
and that's
hugely
really
powerful.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I think I have a couple of mixed views on this. So one of them is that I do fundamentally agree with what you're saying. The flip side of it is almost I fundamentally disagree, and it's not to sort of just because I'm being awkward, but it's more about the fact that I think what we've seen, particularly with the large language model stuff, and a lot of this is obviously driven by ChatGPT, is probably the most well known product that people are using, but it's not necessarily the best all the time, is that people have been looking at this and saying, I can enhance my personal productivity by using this in exactly this way you were saying. I can review 20 contracts in 2 minutes instead of 2 hours, and that is perfectly valid. And that kind of then lends itself to this kind of platitude that we've been telling ourselves, which is like, oh, accountants aren't going to be destroyed by AI, but the accountant who uses AI is going to survive or whatever. And I've mangled that, but fundamentally, what I don't see a lot of people thinking about, and this is where I'm thinking about it, is like, it's great getting that experience out of these people that are going to be retiring in the next few years, and it's great to get that into a model that's usable, but why are we looking at it as a way of enhancing my personal productivity, and why are we not thinking about how do I turn this into something that I face out to a client, one or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 or whatever it is, and deliver what I can do to them at scale, so that I'm almost completely hands off,
Yeah.
and I change the way that I interact with businesses and organizations and clients, such that they're getting the experience of an organization delivered to them at scale in a way that they would never be able to access it.
Have you seen Jack and Jill, the recruitment tool?
Yes. Yeah.
Have you done it? Have you?
I've not played with it, but yeah.
That's almost to where you think, and I agree with you, right? Why? Because I think part of the problem in insurance is the contracts don't become less complicated the further down the food chain they are.
No.
So you get somebody buying online, like, so one of the things I tell MD I know is, do not buy home insurance online, right? That's your house where you live. Buy it off a broker, pay the extra amount of money.
Yeah.
I don't sell home insurance, by the way. It's not my thing, but I always tell people to do that. But if I can scale Jack and Jill type technology to be feeling natural at a conversation, is that better than somebody just bashing on a keyboard on Compare the Market and getting a quote and they have no idea what they bought? None.
Yeah. And I think this is the fundamental thing, is that, we're very lucky as accounting professionals, and I guess the legal professionals in a similar space, and the broking industries in a similar space as well, but probably got more competitive challenges than we have, for example. There aren't for example, in accounting, I can go to a website and find out information about tax or accounting and stuff like that, but I can't really get a service from anybody at the moment that kind of replaces what I do.
Yeah.
Whereas in the broking industry, right, that's exactly what you've got. You've got a whole bunch of online marketplaces that allow you to go and buy insurance, not necessarily specialist insurance and not some of the weird nuanced stuff, but a broad market experience is there. And we haven't had that level of disruption in accounting and in legal, but I'm sure that's got to come next. And we've hidden behind the fact that, oh, there's a level of expertise that puts barriers up in place. Well, maybe there is, but that expertise, like, as I've already said, is really easy to find in a large language model or a small language model. And so it's really the challenge then is actually from an organizational point of view, is like, how do I deliver this? How do I provide a really good experience to someone that maybe is through a chatbot, for example? And I know chatbots have had bad press in the past, but I think, powered by this kind of technology can be incredibly impressive. But it's not just about combining that, it's about how do I combine an experience which says, right, you Mark, could come to our website tomorrow that says, right, you want to do your personal tax return? Great, we'll do it for you. Let's start going through the steps that we need to do. Are you a client of ours? Yes or no? If you're not, right, let's get you on board and do all of that. If you are a client, great, how do we validate that you are a client? How do we check your references back into our systems? That's the challenge for a lot of firms, because they don't have the infrastructure and the technology to be able to do that necessarily. And then even then to go through the next steps of saying, right, okay, send me your P60, send me your investment information, send me a whole bunch of other stuff. There are already technology businesses doing the data extraction from those documents to put into the tax software in the background that are doing this at a huge amount of scale with big firms. And then the latter part of that is then, how do I then get that information out of the tax system, presented back to you in a consumable way through that chat experience or whatever it is? Yeah. such that you can go, okay, right, great, yeah, I'm happy with this, press the button and let's go, and I'm done. And the challenge is an infrastructure issue for a lot of practices to be able to deliver that. It's not a technology issue, because the technology is absolutely there to
Yeah.
do the vast majority, if not all of that. It's an infrastructure and a process problem that a lot of firms face, because particularly larger firms like I was working in, because we've got this hybrid of on-prem and cloud solutions, and getting access to those systems, it can be complex and difficult. But it's going to happen. It's for sure going to happen. Absolutely. There are already apps that allow you to do your own personal tax return through them. The challenge for them is that they can't really scale up and out at the moment, because they can't deal with some of the complexities in the accounting system and tax system at the moment. But there's no reason why they can't address some of those issues. So it's really a matter of like, that's why I'm saying is like, we're looking at large language models and going, oh, this empowers me to do more. Actually, we should be saying, forget me. Actually go back to customers, and how do I do more for customers?
How do you get 20 Johns for one John? Right. Yeah. That is the next step.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So on that cheery final note, then, what's your predictions for 2026?
Oh gosh. I mean, 2026 is going to see even more AI stuff, and this is the problem, is it just becomes a lot of noise, and I think talking to practices around the world, but also here in the UK, it's really difficult for them to cut through the noise and cut through what's really having an impact. I think what we're going to start to see is we are going to start to see an element of that transition. We're already seeing it to a degree of, there are going to be technology or AI powered businesses coming to market that are going to say, look, I can replace staff. We're definitely going to start seeing that. Or I can replace roles, maybe not staff, I can replace roles. And so the prevalence of that at the moment appears to be happening mainly in accounting and bookkeeping stuff. We're talking about sort of some of the month-end close type stuff, being able to do prepayments, accruals, and a whole bunch of other things, but not just that, but a little bit more enhanced than that. There are certainly elements of automation coming into the audit space as well. Again, not really taking away roles, but taking away mundanity from the process, and that's massively needed. If I was going to be really bold, maybe we'll see somebody challenging the market and that kind of commoditization thing that I was mentioning. Maybe we'll see someone come to market and say, look, I've managed to, I can deliver, tax returns to 8,000 people a day, and it'll cost you peanuts.
I think they'll struggle to get PI insurance to do it though.
Well, yeah,
and that it's a bit like the automated cars, right?
Yeah.
It's all very well, but where does liability lie? And that's again where the whole industry not the whole economy needs to move together to get stuff done.
So I mean, I do find this liability discussion really interesting, which maybe is a bit nerdy of me, but and it's good talking to a broker about this, because I'm sure you've got views, but we've seen more recently, I don't think it's really happening here in the UK, but certainly in the US, if you use ChatGPT now and ask a finance related question,
it tells you,
it'll say, oh, this is regulated and don't rely on it. That's just them putting their hands up and saying, don't sue me, basically.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we didn't have that when you did a Google search.
No, we didn't.
And all you're doing there in that example is just doing an enhanced Google search, really. And so I do wonder why people are getting worried about liability, because
Google never gave you the answer. They took you to an answer.
But so does ChatGPT now, because it gives you the sources.
Yes. So I hands up. I just have given up with ChatGPT. I like Perplexity and I like Gemini. Yeah. Right. I think they're better tools for what I use it for.
Yeah.
But Google always never give you the answer. They took you to a page, whereas Gemini puts it on their screen and it does tell you where the source is.
Yeah.
But you read it from their screen.
Yeah.
So there is there is definitely vicarious liability at the least. But I think when you're talking about somebody completely automating the tax process, I think the two things that will slow it down but not stop it, because I think you're right, and this is coming, right, is that the liability piece. Who's liable?
Well, ultimately for me, I think it's the business. So if I set up John's AI tax business
Yes,
limited tomorrow,
yes.
then for me, it's got to be me or the business that's liable.
But if I'm an underwriter and I am underwriting John's accountancy firm, I'm saying, what's John's CV? Da, da, da. How do I gauge how good his software is? I mean, underwriters are living in 1985, right? Most of them, no offense, underwriters. But how do they gauge how good that software is, right? Because they don't have the time to stress test it and do all that good stuff.
Absolutely.
So that's out. I also think that if I'm small independent electrician's business and I'm working 75 hours a week, I just want somebody to shout at if I need to shout at somebody.
Yeah,
I think that's the part. Once that barrier goes, it's open season then.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting one. I mean, I have maybe I have a very sort of black and white view on this. Is like you would never place liability with a technology provider, and we don't do it at the moment.
No.
Right? In accounting practice, for example, we use a whole bunch of different vendors to power what we do, and we don't place liability with them. I think the only time sometimes you could potentially place liability with them, but their contracts are so sewn up that you can't do it, is that there have been instances, particularly in tax, for example, where people have misinterpreted the tax rules in complicated areas, and so calculations have been proven to be wrong. But the reality is like, what the vendors do in the same way that ChatGPT or whoever's doing it is like say, well, we're just a method of getting to an answer. You need to validate that the answer is still correct. And I think that's entirely valid from a technology and software point of view. So I do think, it doesn't matter, what I'm doing and, what kind of technology I'm using, to give a service. If there's a business delivering a service, then the business is ultimately or the individual is ultimately liable for that. And in some respects, I don't expect an underwriter to be able to validate that service.
But they need to write the cover.
I do agree, but I mean, again, you could go back to, if you take technology out of this and we operate in an unregulated space, how does an underwriter validate ABC Accounting Limited that's just started up yesterday with two guys who used to work in a shop?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you need to be regulated by the FCA to sell somebody a $4.99 a month pet insurance product for their rabbit, right? But you can give people tax advice in an unregulated way. It's insane.
Yeah,
that's absolutely insane. And I think that R&D tax credits kind of shone a light on that quite a bit, right? Because there's guys out saying that they're R&D experts who were selling something else 6 weeks before
but they'll have been underwritten for a period of time.
Yeah.
I mean, their insurance is probably invalid now, but they will have been and that I think that's the thing for me is that I think the software market works in a way that should provide cover for genuine problems, and it shouldn't provide cover where people are being genuinely dishonest.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you very much for your time. Customer that we always ask guests, anybody else you would recommend that we invite onto the podcast?
There's probably quite a few people I'd recommend to speak to. I mean, I don't know if you've spoken to him already, but Dave Selleck.
Dave's been on the show.
Oh, damn it. Oh, that's so bad. But yeah, Dave's a good friend of mine. And obviously he has a very, 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 very clear view on like AI and where it's going. I think who else would be really interesting to speak to? If you want to go down the AI thing and you really want to like get really into the weeds of it, I don't know if you've spoken to Jamie Crossman-Smith.
No.
He used to be at GT, but now runs a consultancy called Block AI. And he helped to kind of create at GT their, sort of innovation and AI kind of teams and groups that they've got now internationally. But now, like I say, working on his own and providing like sort of consulting services to predominantly the accounting sector. But yeah, he is like deep in the weeds of like what's happening with the AI world at the moment.
Cool. Well, we'll do that. And thank you very much for your time, John. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.